to another edition of the NatCon Australia podcast. My guest today is Dr. Gordon Menzies. Gordon is an associate professor in economics at the UTS Business School in Sydney. He has had an illustrious academic career, and I'll only mention part of it. Amongst other things, he received his PhD from Oxford University. He is a former economist at the Reserve Bank of Australia and also worked at Treasury. In 2021, he published a book, Western Fundamentalism, Democracy, Sex, and the Liberation of Man, which we'll spend the bulk of our time discussing today. Welcome, Gordon.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Thanks very much. So when did you first start to question liberalism, or at least consider that liberalism could be compared to a fundamentalist ideology?
It was when I was a graduate student at Oxford University. I thought that it would be a great thing to go along and join the debating society, which is called the Oxford Union. So I did that. I went along and engaged in a number of debates, and I found that they were brilliant on the one hand. People were very articulate and logical, but also superficial on the other. So I'll tell you about one debate. It would sometimes be the case that people would be assigned to debate something and the position would be randomly chosen. So I was put down on a debate about whether gay couples could adopt children, and because this was back in 2001, so it was a long way back from where we are now. And I was put down on the side opposing that, and there were two interesting things that happened in that debate. The first is I learned not to trust anybody at the Oxford Union. One of the people on my side said that the reason why gay adoptions shouldn't be allowed is because gay couples are less stable than in terms of their endurance than heterosexual couples, and he listed off a whole range of studies complete with dates to establish this point. And afterwards I said to him, that was amazing. Because these topics were chosen at random. He just walked into that not knowing what we were going to debate. And I said, how did you remember those studies? And he said, I made it up. So that was the first thing I learned, not to trust what anybody said at the union. But the second thing, which is more substantive, is that the debate ended up being won by the opposing side. And the last speaker just referred to a law that had been passed in the UK, and he packaged that up in a particular way and carried the day. And I was surprised that a debate could be won simply by appealing to a law that had been passed, because no matter what your political persuasion, whether you're hard left or hard right, you could always find a law in place somewhere in another time or place which you would regard as morally wrong or reprehensible. So the idea of winning a debate simply by citing a law really puzzled me. Anyway, I went to see one of the leaders, and I said what I just said to you, that the debates were very clever but very superficial. And he said, Gordon, you have to understand that everybody who comes to this university believes uncritically in three things: democracy, free market liberalism, or what's sometimes called economic rationalism or market economics. So democracy, free market liberalism, and sexual freedom. And so that's where I got the idea, the fact that he said uncritically believes, that's where I got the idea of thinking of Western people as a kind of fundamentalist group who rather carelessly, not always, but often carelessly advocate these things without understanding their strengths or weaknesses.
Yeah, I mean, this holy trinity is what you examine in the book, Democracy, Free Markets, and Sexual Freedom, and talk about how liberalism, or at least the limitations of all of those beliefs. The Oxford Union types and wouldn't think of themselves as fundamentalists. They would think of themselves as very open-minded, critical thinkers. And how do you push through that and make people appreciate that they do in fact have quite doctrinaire views on views that they haven't fully considered and thought through the implications of? How do you punch through that?
Well, there's 2 points to make here. The first is that none of us can escape having fundamental beliefs which are not 100% provable. So it's interesting, the term fundamentalist actually comes from the early 20th century when a journalist was referring to a series of pamphlets that were written called The Fundamentals, a testimony to the truth. These were a series of pamphlets written by Christians in the early 20th century, defending some core doctrines of Christianity and then drawing connections between these core doctrines and their detailed opinions. Now, at the time that they said this, it was regarded as extremely irrational to admit that you can't prove your basic beliefs, because at that stage, philosophy was dabbling with ideas that came to be called logical positivism, which is the idea that the only things that you can believe or accept as trustworthy are things that are proved by mathematics or scientific experiments. Now, that view had a fatal flaw in it, which I'm sure you can see, which is that the statement I just gave is not provable either by mathematics or scientific experiments. So it collapsed because it couldn't justify itself on its own criteria. But anyway, that was the mood. The mood was that we're smart people, we can prove everything that we believe from indubitable first principles, just sense experience and just basic things. And this is also called foundationalism in philosophy. Now, foundationalism ran into a lot of difficulty um, over the 20th century and was basically abandoned or modified. And so, for fundamentalists at that stage to say, well, here are our core beliefs, we can't prove them 100%, but we're going to stand on them, and these are the detailed opinions that come from them. It was philosophically ahead of their times. We're all in that position. And so that's the first thing I'd say, that nobody is in the position of being able to prove their fundamental beliefs 100% to any rational person. That's just not what's on offer in life. But as you say, um, one can be a critical thinker. So one can examine or test one's beliefs by reading, by talking to other people. But sadly, the talking to other people has come a bit unstuck in recent times. There's not a lot of skill shown in civil, exploratory, curious discourse about important matters.
I mean, you say you use the term fundamental liberalism, which is probably a bit provocative, but you also say a lesser, softer term might be naive liberalism, a fundamental
Mm,
belief that ever increasing social, economic, and sexual freedom will inevitably overcome violence and folly in human nature. And
mm,
people, I think, want to believe that, right? They want to believe in progress and that we live in a time the motivation for everyone at some level should be to increase people's freedom and happiness, and this is and we're and low and challenge anyone who stands in their way of attaining that utopian kind of ideal. Um, you are a former Reserve Bank official, and you
mm,
started off in the Hawke Keating Howard economic liberalisation of the 80s.
mm,
Um,
mm,
how do you feel about that period now? The
mm.
the tariff falls coming down, the floating dollar, the globalization of finance and trade, both in in Australia, UK, and the United States, amongst other places. Yeah.
Well, generally speaking, I'm very positive about it economically. So well, the thing I'm perhaps best known for is some work on trade liberalisation in the 1980s, and we dropped tariffs sensibly by doing it gradually over time. This is in Australia, and we had a manufactured export boom as a result. And now Australia's manufactured exports are almost equal in value to our rural exports, which is something a lot of people don't know. Um, so I was pretty positive about, and also I could talk for hours about the benefits of a floating exchange rate, but I'll just give one example, which was that during the global financial crisis, every other OECD country had a recession except us. And there were a range of reasons for that. But one reason was that the floating dollar fell 40% and stayed there for a year during the height of the crisis, which stimulated our exports and got us out of a lot of trouble. So we have this wonderful, Australia's a particularly good country to float its exchange rate because it's what's called a commodity currency, which means that the value of our dollar is tied up to world commodity prices. So usually if there's a world crisis, it didn't happen with Ukraine, but usually if there's a world crisis, commodity prices will fall and Australia's dollar will fall with it because it's a commodity currency. And then we get this extra stimulus, which is really very helpful. So I'm generally very positive about the economic changes in Australia since the 1980s. Socially, I'm less comfortable. One of the things that the Hawke-Keating government didn't realise, and I don't suppose there's any way they could have realised it, is that when you marketise, when you increase the scope of markets in society, you actually change the way people think. And I think this is the origin of what people call neoliberalism now. That sometimes that's just a casual pejorative term, but I'll be specific about what I mean by it. Neoliberalism is the popular level movement, which is the expression of the Chicago School of Economics. And in both of them, the idea is that there should be as many markets as possible, number one, in society, but also, more subtly, markets become a metaphor for everything in social life. And society is conceived of as a bunch of autonomous individuals interacting in some kind of market environment. So if you give a gift, it's actually an implicit exchange. It's called a gift exchange. If you're courting, you're in the marriage market. And if you're putting something up on social media, you're developing your brand. So this sort of idea that you as a person are engaging with others in a kind of transactional way, in a kind of market way, I think that's a disaster for society. And I think actually it's a point that should be recognised because you see writers on the far, far left and the far, far right acknowledging this. So both Hayek and Marx talked about the ways in which everything can be reduced to simple exchange. Hayek referred to the market as an extended order, which means that when you relate to your intimates and friends, you're in one kind of sphere of people. But actually, through the market, we relate to people all over the world. And it's what he calls an order, an extended order. And he talked about the danger of the extended order encroaching on our circle of intimates. And so, both on the left and right, you have this concern expressed. And I think it's very much played out in the West today.
How do you decide which areas of life should be subject to market mechanisms? So
I think myself that you ask the basic question, what are markets good for? And then you go from there. What are they good for? What are they bad for? So let's ask that question. Everybody, I think, has three reasons to be grateful to free market liberalism. By the way, free market liberalism, the free market bit, the free refers to just prices moving without too much tinkering with governments and so on. That's the free market bit. The liberalism part is actually an extra idea. It's the idea that freedom in and of itself is valuable. So even if markets didn't do all these good things that they do, which I'll go on to describe, the idea that people are free to make these transactions is seen to be a good thing. So back to the markets, what are they good for? What are they bad for? Well, if you walk down the street and buy something in the next week, you will have three reasons to thank free market liberalism. The first is that there won't be any queues coming out of the shops. The second is that there won't be unsold goods spilling out onto the streets. And the third is what you buy will probably work. Now, the first two things, no queues, no gluts, just has to do with the price mechanism. If there is a shortage of goods, if there's a queue, then there'll be a tendency for prices to rise. As they rise, people will want the stuff less. They'll switch to substitutes, and producers will produce more. And that combination of increased supply and reduced demand will close off that shortage. And if there's a glut, prices will fall, and the sellers will do that to sell the unsold goods. And although they're acting in a completely selfish or self-interested way, as the prices fall, people have less incentive to produce these things. Consumers want to buy them more. And so that will close the gap as well. And finally, the thing will work because in a competitive market environment, if someone sells stuff that obviously and reliably doesn't work, they'll just go out of business. So these are the things that markets are very good for. Now, there's two things that markets will never do, and one thing that they do far too well. The first thing that markets never do is they never deliver on any kind of idea of distributive justice. So if wages are in a completely free market environment, then they'll tend to reflect people's productivity, and without any intervention, someone who's mentally ill or disabled mightn't earn enough to live. And indeed, there are countries where people talk about a class of working poor. So even if you don't have to be someone who thinks that everybody should have absolutely equal incomes, you don't have to be a radical egalitarian to be concerned about this. So that's the first thing markets will never do. They'll never deliver any kind of notion of distributive justice. And secondly, they won't take account of externalities. Externalities are things like pollution. So if you buy a good that's cheap, but it's produced with a very highly polluting technology, then it's going to be really bad for the environment. And the fact that it's too cheap, there's nothing in the market mechanism that'll fix that. So markets have those two limits. I'll come to a question of when to use them, but it'll be implied by those two limits. Mm-hmm. And the third thing that they do far too well is what we talked about before. Commodification is the name used for seeing society as a kind of market metaphor. So my answer to your question is that when goods are... Oh, sorry, I should have said one more thing. When I talk about externalities, of course, one could include in that goods that are morally bad. So there's always a market for controversial things like prostitution. That there would even be a market in a completely liberal world for child prostitution, but these are morally complex and reprehensible, in my view, goods. And so you just let people do what they want and people produce what they want, you'll get those things. So in answer to your question, markets are good at sorting out gluts and shortages for morally uncomplicated goods and for goods that don't have externalities. And but you need some kind of tidying up at the end for distributive justice. And also you need to be very careful about market thinking spilling over into what Hayek referred to there as the sort of circle of intimates or your friends and family.
Yeah, I mean, look, the old Adam Smith idea that the baker and the fisherman or whatever it is go down to the market and exchange goods through the miracle of the invisible hand all makes complete sort of logical sense. But how do you liberalism in itself doesn't seem to have any sort of internal logic as to where you draw the limit about what should be included in the market and what should not be. In other words, it doesn't really can't really explain why children shouldn't be included in for sale or like you said, prostitution or any of the and there isn't. I think proponents of liberalism have a difficulty explaining on what basis limits or should be drawn, right? And the only basis they give for that is subjective judgments by people in authority or the democratic determination. There doesn't seem to be any other justification that liberals can point to for why markets shouldn't be ever expanding into all sorts of other areas. Do you think that's a fair critique?
I'd just add that I think I think when one disagrees with a position, it's important to give it the best possible representation one can. So I think a libertarian would have criteria, something along the lines of the people involved in the transactions have to be adults, so that would rule out child prostitution, has to be consensual, and perhaps they would say they have to be of sound mind. If you're talking about so there would be other criteria, but those criteria would encourage the use of markets. Those criteria are not very strong. They would deal with the most egregious cases, but they're not very strong. So, for example, when you get together, since Christmas is coming up, I don't recommend that you read an article called "The Dead Weight Loss of Christmas." A dead weight loss in economics is a term for something that's inefficient. So, in this article, which is perhaps a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the person concerned said that it's inefficient to give gifts at Christmas because if you give a gift, then obviously the person mightn't like it, and it would be far more efficient to simply give the monetary value of the gift. Now let's have a look at this. Let's analyze this reasonably. Of course, if the person wants the gift that you would have given them, they have the money to go and buy it, so that they're no worse off by you giving them money. But if they don't like the gift that you give them, then they can go off and buy something else they do want. So it's hard to argue in terms of the sort of market mindset of just transacting with people. It's hard to argue with people that you should just give money to people for Christmas. But it just misunderstands relationships, friendships, family. It misunderstands the subtlety and the richness of relationships. So there's no yes, there are criteria, I think, that a libertarian would push back on what you said. They do have criteria, but they won't stop markets going into a whole lot of areas, or market thinking going into a whole lot of areas.
Yeah. Okay. I'm familiar with what libertarians should say because I know quite a lot of them, but they would also, I think, say that, look, what are you talking about, this neoliberalism? We're incredibly regulated in economic matters. We're taxed out of existence, and the idea that sexual relations are completely freewheeling as well is also less and less the case. There's highly stack of laws on whatever sexual harassment and all sorts of other relationships between the sexes and how they should relate to each other. What do you make of that critique? We don't actually live in this uber liberal society at all.
Yeah, I guess the question is compared to what? What's the benchmark you're comparing? So against some kind of I don't think it would be utopia myself, but against what they might think is a utopia where there's very, very little involvement in government at all, no taxes, or well, yeah, I'm not sure. I guess they'd differ in how much they'd accept taxes. The justification for taxes, as I'm sure you know, and as I think some of them would agree with, when you have true public goods like defence, which you just can't provide by a market, and once it's provided, everybody has it, then there's a problem, a social problem, that you can't provide something. And so even people very, very against government involvement would usually support the idea of having taxes to have something like defence. Look, I guess it. The whole at the rock bottom of this, there's the conception of freedom that's going on here. So for a libertarian, and I think for many Western people, the idea of freedom is what I call freedom from, that you just remove all the shackles, and then great things will happen. Now, I'm a fan of freedom. Don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of freedom from, especially in the kind of world we live, where it's often a matter of survival. People can be so oppressed or so dominated by one group or another or one situation, or that freedom from is a real good. I don't deny that, but um, I think there also has to be an idea of freedom for. That is to say, what one goes towards if one has the shackles taken off. And there it really starts to matter if you have any kind of conception of a flourishing life or flourishing human nature.
Mm.
By the way, we've slid between liberalism and my idea of Western fundamentalism, but it's a valid thing to put together, because the unifying idea of Western fundamentalism is that democracy frees us from dictators, markets
Mm.
free us from being prohibited to do mutually advantageous trades with consenting adults, and sexual freedom frees us to have sex with anybody, regardless of any relational commitments they have, as long as it's consensual.
Mm.
So I think there is a kind of liberalism at the bottom of what I've called Western fundamentalism.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think the answer is compared to what? Compared to a world where there, which I would regard as evil chaos, actually, where people just have
Mm.
maximal freedom, a world where you don't take evil seriously. Compared to that world, yes, we're tied up in all sorts of ways, but I think there's actually some good reasons why we're tied up, and that's because evil is a real thing.
Mm. I think that there is a tendency amongst liberal thinkers to say, "Oh, that's all very well. You believe in evil, or you have a particular aversion to some particular social um, phenomenon, abortion, liberalization of marriage, or other things," and they say, "Fine, that's your choice. We've designed the framework where you can exercise your choice one way or another." Um, Adrian Vermeulen, who's a professor at Harvard, and I believe you're probably aware of, he says liberalism relentlessly frames every policy debate in terms of value of individual autonomy and an endless project of human liberation from the oppression of unchosen constraints, including constraints of customary morality, natural law, and even biology, subject only to an override of harm to others where harm has never been well defined and is itself deployed in an inconsistent and politically repressive ways. You would agree with that type of analysis? Would you? Or
There are a lot of statements in that quote. Uh,
I guess.
I agree with the thrust of it. I'm not exactly sure what he means about harm. I think that um, yeah, I think I'd have common ground with liberals who excluded murder. The harm, I agree with the thrust of that, and I would add that it is very important to think what one is getting free from. So the idea that one should be free from unchosen constraints, that was the wording. Um, if that's a fair description of what people think, my goodness, it's so counter to most of human experience. We grow up in families we didn't choose. We carry those families with us through our life, for better or worse. There's so many things that we don't choose that are actually good, or they can be good.
Mm.
This idea of a sort of structuralist world where the autonomous individual it's like life is a pile of Lego bricks and you just make whatever you want. So it's a fascinating coming together, I think, of um, left and right, actually.
Mm.
So extreme libertarians are voluntarists. I think the human will just creates whatever's good, um, and extreme left-wing people are also constructivists. They want to escape things like gender or biology. They want to go beyond the constraints, that all sorts of constraints, including biological ones. So there's an interesting coming together in the current environment of both left and right, and the key thing is personal autonomy and freedom.
Yeah, I mean, they tend, in my view, both the Marxists and the extreme libertarian types have a very reductive view of human relationships, right? The Marxists consider it, tend to review all relationships or view it only through the prism of power dynamics, gender and this, and that exists, but it's not the complete picture, and it's not the full story as to why of the nature of the relationship. Similarly, with the extreme libertarians, they can only see things as in some level as to A, does this maximize freedom, and B, does this generate kind of wealth? The relationship, is there a if it's not fulfilling those criteria, they find it very hard to compute precisely why this existing situation should be in place. You go through, and the most interesting section of your book I found was the section where you do talk about sexual relations, and you say how there's been an importation of this language of the economic liberalization to marriage, so that marriage has trade restrictions, it has a monopoly, it doesn't necessarily maximize, optimize in all circumstances. It's not, it pulls people out of the market where they might be able to optimize better with a different deal, and that's very harmful in your view. I mean, I can see it's harmful, but I love the way you kind of describe it in detail in the book.
Yeah, and the person, interestingly enough, who set out on that course was Gary Becker, who's in the Chicago School of Economics, and he himself was aware of Hayek's problem of the extended order crushing the circle of intimates. So he actually believed in love and altruism in marriage, but his followers asked why the inconsistency of having people operate in a marriage market in one way and then in their circle of intimates in another, because Becker himself had said that stable preferences is a stable way of being, stable attitudes is a virtue in economic analysis. So they kind of hoisted him on his own petard there and brought that kind of thing into the discussion of marriage. So yeah, it has been very damaging, and I so yeah, I think that's right. I think it's been incredibly damaging, and I think it's a half truth to say that the sexual revolution was a quest for a left-wing quest for freedom understood in a particular way for women. That's part of it, but it's also a deregulation of relationships and applying the rules of free market liberalism to sexual relationships. I mean, the thing is, let me put it another way. What do we do in markets? Well, in markets, we buy and sell commodities. Now, I can sell you my computer here. My commodity is a thing. It has no feelings, and it has no relational claim on my loyalty. I can part from it, and nobody sheds a tear. In the legal word is it's alienable. It can be made alien to me. I can't sell you my children. Nobody in the West would advocate that I could. That's because they're not things. They do have feelings, and they have a relational claim on me, so that for me to commercially separate myself from them for money would be a morally reprehensible thing to do. Now, what I see, and the legal word for that is they're inalienable.
Although we do in this day and age allow people to purchase babies in utero, admittedly, from
yeah, that's fraying. I don't think there's no. It seems to be associated with reproduction. It's not yet associated with actually trading children and adult children, or not adult, children that are a few years old, let's say. I think what the sexual revolution has done is it's taken sexual partners. It's a huge shift. It's taken sexual partners from the category of people and put them into the category of things. keeping them is or not is subject to a cost-benefit analysis. If the costs exceed the benefits, then you sell it like you sell your computer, or you part with the person. So I think there's a huge seismic shift there, and I think that's very detrimental for the most part. Not
How do you
entirely.
Oh, look, it's benefited some, no doubt. I guess. I mean, those who are in terribly tragic, I think there's always exceptions to, brutal, violent marriages and the like. But anyway.
Yes, I think there's a social justice reason for liberalising divorce laws. But the distinction I'd like to make is between treating people as people and treating them as things. So you can have a more liberal divorce law, but you're still treating people as people. Whereas it seems to me the kind of sexual marketplace is in great danger of becoming just simply a market for things.
Again, I asked this question before, but I'll ask it in a different way. How do you isn't there an inexorable tendency for liberalism or to expand into areas, and for even like people like Gary Becker, it sounds like he was unable to actually justify why his framework shouldn't include the areas of intimacy or sphere of intimacy that you talked about. And when one looks around the world over the last, since when you want to start counting, at least since the sexual revolution, I suppose, there is always, whenever there's a clash between giving the ability to individual to choose and traditional Christian morality about where limits should lie, the liberalism always prevails, whether it's in abortion or euthanasia. Most recently, the debate in the UK highlighted this, or in no fault divorce in marriage. All these areas, the traditional Christian ethic view of things has been unable to properly prevail and defend itself. And how do you reintroduce that into society, or at least provide a philosophical justification which is easily understood, so that people can explain why these limits shouldn't be crossed in the name of personal autonomy, or at least recognize the costs involved with them? I mean, it's a small question, but do your best, because it's a very pertinent one, because this does seem to be where we're heading. Everything, it's personal autonomy über alles. Nothing can prevent choice in these matters. Choice is always what is under the banner under which legislation is advanced, which destroys either traditional frameworks, institutions, and definitions, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I think we need to go right back to the question of freedom. So Jesus said the greatest source of unfreedom is sin. So there's a passage where he's talking to some people, and he says, whoever commits sin is a slave of sin, but if the Son, that is to say him, Jesus, makes you free, you'll be free indeed. So Christianity sees the great freedom from as freedom from sin. Now that's, for those people who are not Christians, I'll just explain that a little bit. The freedom from sin refers to freedom from the penalty of sin. So God has a right to judge us because we're all people who do wrong things. So Jesus offers freedom from that penalty, but also through life, and then ultimately perfected in the next life. The freedom from sin takes the form of a training process where God teaches us to say no to wrong things and yes to right things. That's the freedom from bit, but there is also a freedom for, which is the adoption into God's family. And so this is a form of human flourishing. So we have both this freedom from and freedom for. And actually, one of my favorite Christian writers, an English gentleman by the name of John Stott, said that if the term salvation, the Christian term salvation, makes no sense to you, freedom is not a bad substitute when it's understood as this freedom from sin and freedom for adoption into the human into God's family as a form of human flourishing. So my answer as a Christian to your question of how to introduce these things, the first answer is for people to turn back to God, and for Christians to be involved in changing people's views about God and what a flourishing human life is. Now, that's not a political or technical fix, where we're so used to, I think it was Albert Einstein saying we have a era of perfected means and confused ends. We're so interested in how to fix the means of something without knowing what we're heading for, whereas I'm suggesting that really God's the person who knows most about human flourishing. So turn back to God would be my basic answer. At a secondary level, though, I guess with some of these things, over time, if people go down the wrong path, you start to see the problems. And so it's a matter of pointing out the problems, which we're doing on this podcast now, and more generally in society. But doing so, I would say, and this is something I'd say to conservatives and progressives, to do so in a really good way. And to do so in a good way means being civil, listening carefully, and it means finding the best possible version of the opinion that you don't agree with and argue with that, not a straw man. And I think it also means being aware of what your fundamental beliefs are. If I can give you a quick example of this, I'm a visiting scholar at a college in Sydney, and I run something called the Socratic Club, and it's a student discussion group. And after Roe versus Wade was overturned, a young woman came and said she wanted to run an evening about that. And I, just from knowing her, I think she's a pro-choice woman. So I said that was fine, because it's it's a group where all views are welcome and none are privileged. You have to defend your views. Anyway, at the last minute, she pulled out. And so I was left to run this evening on abortion, which was not comfortable. But what I did was I got everybody to fill out a pro-life, pro-choice questionnaire, so that a high score meant you were very favoured to interventions, ending people's lives, late-term abortions, and a very low score meant you were very conservative or worried about these things. And I got everyone to get in a line according to what score they had. And then the task was to find someone at the other end of the line and explain what you would have to change about your basic beliefs to agree with the other person. Now, to my surprise, the evening went incredibly well. And I think it's because when you get clarity about what people's basic beliefs are, then some of the arguments about detailed opinions kind of go away, because you see where they come from. And the evening worked well, I think, because people would recognize in that issue that there are some basic beliefs. And that's what I hope what listeners are getting out of this conversation, is that it's all very well to talk about choice and freedom, but what is it that's the cause of unfreedom? And when you get free, what is it that you want? No, I've even put that the wrong way. Is there a true form of human flourishing that one should be heading for?
I always think that you're talking about a freedom fit for humans, not a freedom fit for animals.
Yes.
Animals can run around with to try and satisfy their appetites, whatever they may be. And
yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. There is such a thing as a human nature, which is more developed and a gift from God. There's a givenness to human nature rather than something we just make up.
I do wonder out loud how much more evidence you do need to demonstrate to people that some of these liberalizations in the social realm have been catastrophic and chaotic, like you said. There was a stat when I was in London recently. Someone was throwing around saying that it's about 50% of people in Greater London, children, grow up. Less than 50% grow up at the age of 14 with two parents in the house. So a very sensitive topic. People are defensive about that, why they made those choices and whether they're harming the children in the process. I think that's why it's hard to sometimes engage in the debate. But at what point does and how does the rectification occur? Because that sort of seems like an unsustainable model to continue on with if you want society to, thrive in any sort of way.
Yeah, it's a good question, and thanks for raising the sensitivities too, because I think one does need to be sensitive. I've seen this from a number of angles. My parents were divorced, and my father was a very irresponsible man, and I am actually grateful to second wave feminists, the ones who pushed for liberalisation of divorce laws for truly abusive marriages. And they argued for recognising marital rape, although as far as I know, that wasn't a problem for my parents. I've experienced a family breakup myself. I know that sometimes it's not possible to keep marriages together. So these are very sensitive issues. But it seems to me that as it were, the pendulum has swung too far. I can imagine, we're talking about this issue of, I guess, divorce and family formation. I can imagine a society which is somewhat more conservative about keeping families together, but not as tolerant of persistent emotional, physical, or sexual cruelty, which it was in the past, using the indissolubility of marriage as a sort of reason for that. So I can imagine a society which is better set up than this one is, and I suppose it would go something like this. I use the metaphor of driving. So when you drive, it is factually true that you could have a terrible accident and you could be killed or maimed for life, or you could kill somebody else. That is a fact that's just undeniable. And yet, when you're driving, for the most part, you just screen that out of your thinking. And in fact, to think about it all the time would make you a bad driver. You'd be nervous. Every car that came along, you'd be looking this way and that. And so it's something that it's true, but it's screened out. Now, the trouble with with an environment like the one we're in is it's so liberal, I think, that it's almost as though when people are married, it's like they're going out together, and that if it doesn't work out for them, they split, and that's okay. Whereas you could imagine a society where, a bit like driving, people are together. They know it's possible that something terrible could happen, but they're not, as it were, putting it into their calculations. So one of the things that Becker and his followers talked about, or his followers really, was talked about how the outside option in marriage, that's to say the thing you go to if marriage doesn't work out, can become a determinant of power within the marriage. It increases your bargaining strength. So that's the phrase they use. Well, that kind of a way of thinking, which economic thinking encourages us to use, I think is very, very destructive to relationships. So I can imagine a society which was not as tolerant of persistent emotional, physical, and sexual cruelty as it has been in the past, but is tighter than now, to the benefit of a lot of people. Because when we talk about social justice, we don't often talk about the rights, if I can put it this way, of children to grow up in an intact family. So is the current environment more just than the past? Well, it's scoring well on some things, but very badly on others.
Indeed. Look, anyone who I encourage everyone to read the book, because what's clear without is your sensitivity born of a variety of different experiences in life to how there's more to life than economics in some ways, or that economic thinking needs to be put in a particular category. It can be useful in some areas and not necessarily in others. There has been, over the last couple of years, a lot of, in my way of thinking, a lot of new and interesting academic thinking focusing on critiquing liberalism. Your book is one of them, but they're outside of Australia. I think I mentioned some of the names, but Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeulen, James Orr, Yoram Hazony, David Goodhart, political scientists, writers like Rod Dreher, Sohrab, writers on women's issues like Louise Perry and Mary Harrington. Um, there hasn't been, outside yourself and a few others that I've interviewed, as much in Australia. Do you think there's something about Australia that makes it more difficult to consider a philosophical conservative critique of liberalism? For example, we have the major centre-right party in Australia is called the Liberal Party. It held a celebration which promoted 80 years of liberalism recently. That's not what the UK Conservatives or the Republicans and Canadian Conservatives, that's not the way they talk. Some of the thinkers, the liberal market thinkers here, like David Kemp and others, say Australia has always been a liberal nation and the like. I just wonder whether it's either a case that we haven't. Look, you can always say, look, they're more intellectually sophisticated over there, but we've got our thinkers here too. Whether there's something to do with our particular society which isn't as sympathetic towards, like I said, a conservative or traditionalist critique of liberalism.
Yeah, I'm myself, I'm not sure that I'm a conservative. My view as a Christian is that when I'm presented with a bundle of policies, either from the left or the right, I tend to unpick them and try and take things issue by issue. So it'll be obvious from some of the things I've said that I'm not that I'm socially conservative in a lot of sexual politics causes, but economically I'm quite open to trying new things. I'm not uniformly negative about government intervention. I'm not utopian about it, but I'm not. I think it can solve some important collective action problems. As to why Australia is not perhaps a thought leader, I suppose this could take us far too long to talk about, but Australian universities have been under enormous pressure to be more and more commercially driven and more utilitarian, actually. And so there's a lot of pressure on academics to, as it were, contribute to the economy and make sure they can commercialize their research and so on. So this kind of thing is distracting and doesn't really. That's sort of one pressure against free thought, and the other pressure against free thought is the, I guess, the kind of how can I put this? I guess the other pressure against free thought is that there's a range of causes within universities that one just knows one is supposed to support without there being much debate about them. And so I think that's also stifling on creativity and thinking. So yeah, I'm not sure. I suppose it's always been the case that there has been leaders and followers culturally. So before the Second World War, Europe was undoubtedly the leader of the thought world, and after the Second World War, that shifted to the US. So there's a bit of that going on too, I suspect.
Just doubling back to what we initially discussed, I mean, the election of Donald Trump and then the economic nationalism, nationalist political movements, however you want to describe it, where there's been a pushback against open borders in trade and finance and other things, and deindustrialization. Are there elements of that have caused you to reconsider some of your earlier enthusiasm for sort of 1980s, 90s, Hawke, Keating, Howard economic liberalism?
Look, what I'd say about that is that I think the presumption for, say, free trade is very strong. And I tell my students, if I built a brick wall around Sydney and demanded that everything that people consumed in Sydney was produced in Sydney, most people would die. People would recognise it's foolish within a country to just make arbitrary borders and then, insist that the Riverina has to have iron smelting. It just has to. These kinds of things within a country, they look odd because they are odd. They're irrational. You want certain areas to do what they're best at, and so on. So you can see immediately that what globalization advocates do is they just say, well, this is true of the world writ large, that you just want places to do what they're best at, and then they trade with each other. And that is all fine, except that there are serious disruptions, in which case you, as it were, turn in on the nation state. And so I don't mind people saying, I want to introduce trade restrictions so we can have self-sufficiency, so we can bring industry back to Australia and so on. I don't mind that. But as I said earlier, I just footnote, Australia's manufactured exports are nearly as big as their raw ones. So it's not as though there's no technologically advanced stuff going on here. But I think that's all fine to say, just as long as you realise that there is a cost. So what is, I think, an indefensible thing to say is that if we go back to a form of economic nationalism, that will necessarily be better off economically for it. With Brexit, I mean, Brexit's a classic example. Because I think there's more to life than economics, I think it can be rational for Brexit to occur. I don't see any way that could have been economically beneficial to unlink oneself from one of the largest markets in the world and introduce all sorts of distortions and restrictions and not find alternative markets. I can't believe myself that that's economically rational. But if a nation is prepared to pay the cost for more legal autonomy, more cultural autonomy, that's fine. So has it given me pause? Yeah, I guess with a lot of people, the experience of COVID, not being able to get certain things when we wanted them, when we needed them, that has pushed me back a little bit against my free trade instincts. But yeah, as I say, I still think there's always a cost to that kind of thing. Donald Trump, by the way, will have a difficult time. The tariffs and the removal of a lot of immigrants may help a lot of people who voted for him. They made the unskilled workers, there'll be pressure on wages as a result of illegal immigrants going, and that'll push up their wages. The tariffs may help certain regions in the United States that have done very badly out of globalization. That's all possible. It's complicated. It remains to be seen how that plays out. But he'll find it hard because it'll tend to push up prices, both the tariffs and the increased wage costs from getting rid of the immigrants. So he may have some inflationary troubles as well.
It seems to me, though, it is of a kind with your well, one could say in the same way that while it provides greater freedom and cheaper goods and additional exchanges, free trade, it leaves off the table things like economic sovereignty, the ability to defend yourself, the ability to provide work for people on the left side of the bell curve who are much more disposed to manual labor. It does matter who you're trading with, not just that you're like, it's difference between trading between Sydney and Melbourne is different between trading between Sydney and Shanghai, because it's a different nation, it has different national interests, and those things aren't probably, at least I have come to appreciate, always factored in as well into sort of when people are doing the economic cost benefit analysis on whether trade makes sense. Because if the lights go on and you can't import whatever you need from Shenzhen, the cost of actually having to boot that up and develop it yourself can be quite significant. Yep. And it also poses geopolitical and other risks. Look, we've gone on for an hour. I've really enjoyed the discussion. There's clearly a lot more areas that we could go down. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where should they go, Gordon?
They should buy the book.
Out on Audible. You've done a recording?
Sorry?
You've done a recording. It's going to come out on Audible soon, right?
Yes, I'm in the process of doing a recording, so it should come out as an audiobook soon. Yep,
Okay.
yep.
Yeah,
But
perfect.
otherwise, you can buy it on Amazon. I'm a full-time academic, so I don't have. I've learned with internet presence that you either do it very well or you don't do it, and so I have a limited internet presence. But there have been a number of podcasts with someone who your viewers may or may not have heard of. His stage name's Destiny. He's a
Right. Yeah.
US blogger. Um,
Cool.
and there've been a number of long form conversations I've had with him, which are kind of fun to listen to.
Yeah, okay. I'll have to tune into Destiny. God knows, it's not one I follow as much as, but I know of him. So I really appreciate the discussion. I'll leave you to it to get on with your day, and I hope to keep in touch as we go forward. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Bye.